we already know that Elon Musk, the richest person in the world, wants a lot more than just money. He's sought political influence through his short-lived bromance with Donald Trump. He's tried to dominate the electric car industry, commercial space travel, and social media through his various ventures. But it is his Starlink satellite system that could give him more power than anything else. The company is close to being able to provide internet access to remote locations at a fraction of the price of alternative technology, such as fibre optic broadband. Indeed, it's quite widespread already. This has led to some governments expressing interest in doing deals with his company. But could we end up in a situation where vital infrastructure used by countries around the world is controlled by Elon Musk? And is that a situation that we want? Well, Emma Gatti is a former NASA scientist who is now the director of the Space Republic, a media platform focusing on space and geopolitics, and joins me now. Hello, Emma.
Hello, Hugo. Good morning. Hi, nice to see you.
Good morning. Thanks for being with us. Just take us through exactly what Starlink is and why governments are so interested in it.
Well, Starlink, let's put it this way. In nowadays world, we are all somehow dependent, profoundly dependent from the internet. And when you live in a city like me, the general broadband is no problem. So you have a very fast internet connection every day. And internet connection doesn't mean just scrolling on Google. It means being able to access your bank details, being able to do important insurance operation, access to medical details, etc. So it's a fundamental infrastructure, like a train or a hospital, fundamentally. This is how we should start to see the internet. Now, because of how internet has been set, if you live in a rural area or if you live in areas that are not covered by the broadband, you fundamentally cannot have access to internet, which is meaning to say you cannot have access to a fundamental infrastructure. Starlink has somehow broken this problem because they have started to provide a service that until 10 years ago was not available, which means using satellites to connect every single human being on the planet to internet through satellite in orbit, so not through the ground like is fundamentally working like now. And this has created a revolution because originally satellites were placed too far out in the orbit. So the signal was so slow that there was no gain somehow. It didn't make any sense to use internet through satellite. But if you lower enough the satellite, so you place them in what we call low Earth orbit, something around 350 kilometers distant from Earth, that changed the game. Because the satellite signal is so much faster that fundamentally you have the same speed that you have between you and I if we live in Milan or London, fundamentally. And that changed things.
Okay, so Starlink, I mean, it already exists. People use it in rural places. People use it on cruise ships as well. And I seem to remember. But I mean, I guess the situation changes again if and when Starlink becomes considerably cheaper than kind of sort of cable-based broadband, right?
Well, the situation is changed because at the moment, the company that can provide access to this service is only one company and is owned by one single person, which is Elon Musk. In Europe, this is very difficult to understand because the European situation is much different. If you think about OneWeb, for example, which is a UK-French initiative, is owned partially by the English government and partially by the French government. So there is no one person that can make a decision, that can decide to do yes or no, switch off the light or switch it on. With SpaceX, it's different because the major shareholder, I think more than 50% of the stocks are still owned by one person, which is Elon Musk, who has demonstrated to be, let's say, politically and temperamentally flaky. So people start to be worried that all this important infrastructure is in the end of one single person, which is monopoly in the end.
I mean, Starlink is being used extensively in Ukraine, is it not?
Yes, it's been that's where the world noticed the importance of this type of this communication, what we call LEO communication in Ukraine, because it has a fundamental advantage of communication. The communication is so fast that you can communicate in real time. But what's happening in Ukraine, if you remember, Hugo, is that Ukraine didn't pay the bill and the US decided to don't cover the bill. Elon Musk literally switched off the service. It's called the Crimea accident. So literally from one day to the other, their light was off.
So, I mean, how do countries then protect themselves from this kind of influence? Does it mean not using Starlink and continuing to use less efficient, cheaper technology? Does it mean each nation having its own huge fleet of satellites that they put up there instead? What can they do?
So this is a very interesting question. We're living this problem right now, Hugo. We know there is no final solution. One partial solution that has been found is that the United States government, after the Crimea accident, pushed obliged SpaceX to put a clause in the contract which says if you switch off the service again, you're going to pay a really high fine. So somehow this is a way to protect the contractors, to avoid this kind of like impulsive behavior, let's put it that way. So theoretically now, a country or an institution or a private buyer of Starlink is more protected than before from this type of behavior. That doesn't mean that is 100% insurance and this is not going to happen again. And we go to the next step, which is try to have what we call redundancy, other services that are not completely relying on Starlink. However, we need to understand that Starlink is ahead of time. We speak about 9,000 satellites at the moment. So everything, any type of new system is behind. So they still have to catch up. We might still to have alternative solution in 2030, 2035, 2040, but we speak about 10 years from now.
Dr. Emma Gatti, former NASA scientist and director of the Space Republic, thanks very much indeed. I'm joined now by John Sheldon, who's the co-founder of Astra Analytica, a research and consulting practice specialising in space. John, hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for being with us. Look, if you were advising a government on its internet strategy, would you suggest using Starlink or would you suggest that they run a mile?
No, I would suggest that they use Starlink, but that Starlink would be just one pillar of their internet strategy, not the entire thing. So there has to be redundancy, as your previous commentator said. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be an alternative satellite internet provider anytime soon, but there are, other alternatives that can be used, such as fiber optic cable and these kind of things.
Should we worry at all about one sort of powerful private provider providing this kind of stuff? Because, I mean, we do have some infrastructure monopolies in this country, at least. You know, we have, Virgin has its cable network. You know, Railtrack used to have all the train lines and so on. And it's not like oil is sort of state provided. Energy, generally speaking, relies on the state on the private sector as well. Is this so different? Are we just frightened of it because it's Elon Musk?
Well, a bit of both, but your previous examples that you mentioned, such as the rail and telecom here in the UK, were provided by companies that were based here in the UK and therefore under UK law and therefore could be essentially sanctioned, coerced or influenced to do the right thing. The problem with SpaceX, of course, it's not a registered company here in the UK, it's in the US, and therefore it is out of our jurisdiction. So there would be a problem in relying exclusively on Starlink for any function, whether it's for commercial or military, without some sort of proper recourse where we can at least impose sovereignty where required.
Let's talk about the military aspect here. What kind of things do militaries use satellites like this for?
Well, Starlink, of course, is a low Earth orbit satellite communication system. So obviously, SATCOM communications, both voice, data, and so on. And given its low Earth orbit, very low Earth orbit, means the latency, in other words, the time the signal takes from satellite to user, is extremely quick. Therefore, the communications are much more efficient and quick. But you can use it for other things like, for example, geolocation, geofencing, which basically means putting a box where there's no communications. Geolocation means you can actually triangulate signals from the adversary and locate where they are. All these kind of things. You can transfer intelligence imagery, other data quickly between users and so on. Whereas with the larger communication satellites, such as the UK Skynet system, which is in geostationary orbit, which is at about 22,300 miles altitude, the latency is quite long, but also the bandwidth, in other words, the amount of data that can be transferred is actually very limited. So the UK relies on, as do other militaries, commercial communication satellites such as Starlink, but not just Starlink. So it can be an issue, and until, as your previous guest said, there is a viable alternative such as Amazon Leo, then it could be an issue if we do rely on Starlink for very important things.
As military conflict gets more and more dominated by drones, as we've seen in the war between Ukraine and Russia, do things like Starlink become much more important? Because presumably they make drones much easier to operate.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, drones can't operate over long distances without satellites, and not just Starlink, but also with what they call positioning, navigation, and timing. We often refer to this as GPS, the Global Positioning System, which is the system the US provides, but there's also Galileo, and there are also Chinese, Russian, and Indian variants. And then on top of that, you need Earth observation. So, for example, if you're operating in a large geographic area, it's very inefficient to use drones to find something. What usually happens is you use very high altitude drones, or you use low Earth orbit Earth observation satellites to detect something, and then you direct the drones into that particular location to take a closer look.
So it's obviously not feasible for any country, let alone the United Kingdom, to basically put up its own Starlink to compete with Elon Musk and basically do the same thing again. So what could we do?
Well, one way you could do is, yes, use Starlink, but then augment it with your own, say, 100 satellite constellation in low Earth orbit over the area of interest, i.e., the UK and its immediate region, so that if Starlink goes down, you have a backup. This can be done relatively affordably. In other words, it's not going to be cheap, but it's not also going to be, say, the HS2 rail service either. But you can use very small satellites. So, you're probably talking about £2 or £3 million per satellite. And you can use that to augment. Then, as other services come online, like Amazon Leo, which used to be called Project Kuiper until very recently, you can then basically diversify your Leo Satcom portfolio.
Are there any countries that are doing this for themselves that are basically trying to compete with Starlink on a sort of a state level? Are the Chinese doing this? Are the Russians doing
Yes.
this?
The Chinese certainly are doing it. They're doing it with several of their private companies. One is Shanghai Space Sail, and also known as 1,000 Sails, and they are launching satellites. In fact, just last week they launched a batch of satellites for that constellation. And then there's G Space, and Geely Motors owns that, and Geely, of course, owns Volvo and other car companies, and they're doing similar. And of course, these can be used by the Chinese military as well. But they're far behind as well, mostly because China doesn't have a reusable launch system yet, which makes it more expensive to launch these large constellations as opposed to SpaceX, which does have a reusable launch system. And then Russia. Yeah, Russia has at least ambitions to create this kind of constellation, but given the parlous state of the Russian space program in general, it's very unlikely we're going to see anything substantive in the next decade or so, given that situation.
Finally, John, is there an argument that the governments, if not our government, then perhaps the American government, should be wresting control of this stuff from private companies because it simply shouldn't exist in private hands?
Well, I mean, this is where Elon Musk himself is perhaps, his own worst enemy. I've heard, and this is just chatter, so it's not official, but both in the US and the UK, among officials and military officers, many of whom, by the way, are true blue conservatives, Republicans, saying we need to nationalize this because we just can't let one man at a whim decide on major geopolitical issues because of, well, frankly, the rather
Yeah.
weird places he's getting his information and worldview from.
Quite so. Thank you very much indeed. That is John Sheldon there, the co-founder of Astro Analytica. Thank you very much indeed, John.